Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Education Continuation Task Force on July 27th, 2020. Thank you all for joining us. I know several individuals were unable to be with us today or be joining late. The Lieutenant Governor will be unable to join until around 1:30. So hopefully we can hear some comments from her at that time or at the close of the meeting. We do have a very lengthy agenda today. And I know we'll have some questions. Please pay attention to the guiding questions, and I'll ask all presenters to please make sure you read and go over the guiding question before you present, and then also before we start taking questions. The guiding question is, those are designed to bring about discussion, and we are not just seeking questions. We will, of course, take questions and welcome questions, but we want feedback and additional guidance from you as members of this task force regarding things we may have missed, things you're hearing from your member group, from your members in your organizations, so that we can continue to hone this guidance, because we all know that it will continue to evolve and change. So some of the guidance has already been issued, others have not, but please know that all of your feedback is important, and we use that to continue to refine this guidance. We won't do a roll call in the interest of time, but you can click on the participant icon in the middle of your screen when you move your pointer around, and if you click on the participants, they will show to the right of your screen. Those in attendance, and then those obviously invited that are not in attendance. And then please use the chat feature for any updates during the meeting. You can also, in lieu of raising your hand or speaking, which we encourage you to do, you can also use the chat feature to make comments. The information included in the chat's also included in the meeting minutes, and we do use that as part of the feedback as well. So David, we'll go ahead and kick it off. David Cooks is with us to talk about participation guidelines.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you. A lot of stuff going on around non-traditional instruction and all of the things that encompasses as we think about reopening schools. The guiding question is what supports do districts need to implement the new participation recording and reporting requirements for 2020-2021. So Melody, are we gonna, I don't have slides.
That's okay, you can just speak if you don't have slides.
Okay. Actually what I'll do is share my screen. I guess pardon me, I thought we had a slide deck, so this is fine because it's been used in front of the superintendents. And just 1 second. Okay. So as I said, there's the guiding question. So for the 2021 school year, it's important to note as we start this conversation that school districts will not be reporting attendance as they have in the past. The emergency regulations that were recently passed by the state board decoupled attendance and funding, so we won't be actually collecting information that is submitted to the department for attendance for this coming up school year. Attendance for students that are in person in-person situations will still be collected locally for safety reasons and other necessary needs, but it won't be reported to the department or to anyone else. In lieu of that, or in place of that, we will be recording participation for every student in a school district into the Infinite Campus Student Information System. And we'll explain a little bit in a minute about what that means in a different sense for students who are in person and students who are doing their learning virtually or remotely. So daily participation is defined as measures of interaction between students and teachers. Those interactions obviously will be different if the student is participating in in-person instruction than they will be if a student is participating remotely. It's a measure, participation, it's important to remember, is a measure of the engagement of the student in the instructional process. It is not a measure of the quality of work that a student is doing. So we're not trying through participation to say that a student has completed a set of assignments and has done very well on it. That's why we have grades. This is merely to say we have knowledge that the student has been participating in the instructional process. Instructional participation will be recorded every day of the instructional calendar, and it will be recorded for a student whether they are in person or they are learning in a remote situation. It'll be recorded it'll be entered on a daily basis, but that entry can be done at intervals less than daily. So recently, the State Board of Education enacted an emergency regulation from the pupil attendance regulation, and it defines in that regulation what non-traditional instruction is. It says that it means remote instruction in which the student is learning in a location other than the traditional classroom using digital or other alternative methods of learning. It can be a term used for any situation in which a student, a group of students, whole schools, or whole districts are learning from a location other than the brick and mortar school building. So it's an overarching term that we use for all forms of instruction that are taking place remotely. It does have some very specific purposes, and we'll look at those next. The first and most well known, and what we did back in the spring, is the use of NTI, or non-traditional instruction days. Those are specific. That's a specific type of non-traditional instruction used most frequently, and that's when an entire school district is closed to in-person instruction. So we claim NTI days, as everyone did back in the spring, when the entire district is closed to in-person classes. But it's not only that. There are other uses of non-traditional instruction, and those can vary district by district. And all of the planning that everyone's doing right now is to be prepared for all these different things that may need to occur when we have students who may not want to come back to class for safety reasons or anything else that might occur in the district. So the first, these are a series of options or things that you might see in a school district. And each one of these would be considered non-traditional in its sense. The first is a full-time virtual school student. That's a student who the district isn't enrolling in a virtual situation full time, and they're most likely going to stay in that virtual situation for a period of time. The second is a school-based virtual model, similar to the first, but it is a model where the student is still attached to their classes. In the first model, the full-time virtual, they're actually being put into an academy or a school that's a new place for them with different teachers than their traditional classroom teachers. The second involves the student still being with their traditional classroom teachers, but learning virtually. So there's the distinction between those two things. Then you have a blended learning model or a hybrid model that is occurring in many of our district's plans coming into the year, where you might have an A-B model, where you might have part of the kids at school on Monday, Wednesday, part of the kids at school on Tuesday, Thursday. On the other 2 days, they are learning virtually, and then all of the students are learning virtually on a Friday, as an example. So that we probably will see quite a bit of that. Then the fourth thing that I've listed here is when you might have a partial school closure, which means we think this will probably occur more frequently than it obviously has been before, where elementary school A may have to shut down because of a spike in cases at that school, but not the entire district needs to shut down. So that is another way in which some students will be learning virtually and some students will still be in the traditional models of classroom education. So another thing that's important to note is in previous years, when you were doing NTI days, full days, where the whole district was out of school, all of that was done on the back side when it came to the school calendar, the district calendar. We didn't allow you to front load NTI days because before the pandemic, most of them were related to weather or other kinds of issues like that. So you didn't know when those days were going to be happening in your calendar. But this year, of course, because of what I just mentioned, hybrid models, we're going to have days that are going to be known on the front end to a school district as NTI days. So we're allowing them for the coming up year to, in their district calendar, which is due this Friday, they're going to be allowed to enter NTI days on the calendar just like they would a regular instructional day. So we talked about participation. We used participation for NTI this last spring, but at a very different level. Now we are going to be using it for every student in every classroom every day. And so when a teacher goes into the system and enters participation, and remember they're doing this instead of in the IC system recording attendance, they're gonna know that if a student is in person in their classroom, then it's almost like a substitution of attendance. You're simply going to record participation as them being there in the room with you. That's what participation will mean for students who are in person in class. For students who are in remote learning or virtual learning situations, you're going to record participation and you're going to use one of these 4 options as a way of delineating their participation in the classroom. One-on-one video communication or phone calls between a teacher and a student, or a teacher and a parent if you're talking about smaller children or students with special needs. Second way is group video communication or phone calls between the teacher and a whole class, or between a teacher and small groups of students within a class. The third way is by looking at logs inside a learning management system, which most districts now use, to determine that the student has been completing assignments and so forth, has logged into different things that the teacher might have placed on the learning management system. And the fourth, one that we know very well, is the submission of paper-based assignments for students in a non-digital, non-traditional setting. So if your district is sending out packets, what we know to be true in most cases is those packets are weekly packets, and that's the reason for the requirement to enter the participation information into IC is not a daily requirement, although you're entering it every day. For purposes of this last bullet, you might get a packet on a Friday or a Monday, and you would go back into IC and enter participation for the dates that packet was for. So you could be entering it on the back end for a whole week in that example. One of the things that we've been talking to folks about throughout this process is Infinite Campus has done an incredible job over this summer of creating new functionality in the program to allow for all of this information to be incorporated into our process, the participation information, to allow for all of these plethora of models that might be coming forth, and they call it blended learning functionality. So there's going to be the ability for folks to code students in different groups of students based on whether they're virtual or in person or hybrid, and then they can move in and out of those groups fairly easily in Infinite Campus. So the functionality is really going to be beneficial to everyone. And then finally, we're going to report the daily participation at 3 points during the year. October of 2020, January of 2021, and July of 21. And that report, it basically means the state is going to pull a participation report from Infinite Campus at the district level, and we'll report that data through the Kentucky Department of Education communication methods and also to the Legislative Research Commission. All right. So that's the end of the presentation, Commissioner. If there are questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
David, this is Dave Johnson at Southeast
Hey,
South
Dave.
Central. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. Listen, I think with Jefferson County and Fayette County making their decision, and then we've seen some others around doing that, and I know in my area, I've got some folks that are starting to talk about starting online.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a transition now where there's going to be folks in this next month or so are really going to start thinking about what is it going to take for my teachers to be able to get into that at the very beginning of the year.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of training are they going to need? What are the topics that they're going to need to be focused on? Have you got any suggestions about that, about maybe what we should be talking with our folks about?
Yeah, and in fact, I have to admit, David, that I lose track of the different schedules that we're working on. But Marty Park and the digital learning team at KDE and my team are working with each of the co-ops, and I know that Laura Reganos has scheduled sessions with each co-op, and I'm not sure if your all's has happened yet, but we're going to be really linking up and providing that kind of professional learning support for teachers through what we're calling design labs at each of the co-ops. And I don't, like I said, I have to go back and look at the schedule, but I know that the team is working with each co-op to schedule out opportunities, and a lot of it is already developed course content for how you do these things. Teachers do these things, so it's nothing we have to build. So and I'm sure Marty or David is on the call today. I know Marty is because he has an agenda item, and we can certainly I can figure out when that is for you all, but I know that we've got those things scheduled for each co-op, and those design labs will actually allow for the specific kinds of needs of the teachers in your districts as we start out this school year. So we're planning pretty quick pushes into each co-op before the school year actually starts.
Yeah, I think my meeting, it might be Thursday of this week.
Okay.
I've got that scheduled. I was just wanting to make sure that was going to be a topic of discussion that day.
That is actually what you're going to be talking about with our teams. You're going to be talking about all of the things that we're going to look at, what we call the 4 pillars of the digital conversation about what your districts need in the way of support, and you're going to help us identify in your particular co-op what specifically that means and how we provide that support to you.
Sounds good. Yeah, we've had conversation around those 4 pillars. We know what we're probably going to be focusing on.
So that's what we'll do on your Thursday meeting is discuss that in more detail.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.
Anything else? Any other comments? Let's check the chat, David.
Yeah, let me go back and.
I think there's a comment from Nancy.
Trying to understand, school districts could do a combination. Nancy, could you?
Absolutely. Hi, David.
Hi.
I was just meaning, really, you could almost have, you might have 2 of those or 3 of those.
Exactly. And that's what IC has done a really great job of expanding the functionality of this summer in allowing that to occur, so that you don't have to. Before the pandemic, you either put kids in person or you put them in a virtual performance-based class, and that was it, right? You either did one or the other. This is going to allow you to go in and out of, you're going to be setting up groups, blended learning groups, they call them. And so students could be in a face-to-face situation 2 days a week and in a virtual situation, and they can be in both those things. And you can record all that stuff in IC, and participation can be different on different days.
Right. We put out our plans, as you know, they've been kind of fluid. They change, and so we've got them at least down today to. I sent those out this morning. But I think that that's kind of the scary point. I had heard some superintendents even are going to allow the students to do that on a daily basis. If they choose to be at home one day, come the next day, or whatever. So I would think that's going to be pretty tough on them to be able
Yeah,
to.
that's going to me, that would be a lot of additional hard work that's going to have to be done to maintain understanding the numbers for kids that are in person and the numbers for kids that are remote. But they can do that. I mean, that's the point, is that I think is the functionality exists. If they did want to spend that extra effort, they could do it.
Thank you.
I think that was it, Commissioner. So.
How many other partners do we do that with? And you know, there's something then in all of this. Some
You're muted, Kevin.
Not sure if that was background noise or someone was asking a question. Must have been background. David, thank you. If you have any further comments or feedback regarding this item, of course, continue to put that in the chat, and David will be on for the remainder of the meeting. Next, we have Greta Hilton, Carol Ann Morrison, and Veronica Thacker, and probably Chris Thacker, if I remember correctly, from this routine from the last few days. But Chris hasn't gotten the billing, so I will include him for considerations for reopening schools, exceptional learners, and preschool students. Greta and team.
Thank you, Commissioner. And unfortunately, we don't have Chris Thacker with us today, so it'll be me and Veronica Sullivan and Sylvia Starkey that will be sharing the information from these slides with you. And as we get started, I do want to reiterate, and I've said this before, and I think many of you may have heard me say this, that as we issue special education guidance, I want you to just keep in mind that we are receiving support from USA's Office of Special Education Programs. And as things move through, you know, some of these, you know, more highly litigated states, as things move through the dispute resolution processes, there could be some changes in the guidance, because there could be things that play out in the Sixth Circuit that would be binding to us. So I just want to let you know on the front end that should things change, then there's some rationale for why. Next slide, please. So as we go through, really this is a two-part presentation. The first part that Veronica is going to dive a little deeper into momentarily is around reopening guidance for students with disabilities. And as she concludes that part of the presentation, then Sylvia Starkey will talk to you about the differences in compensatory education and extended school year, as well as the similarities. So as we start the first part of the presentation, the question that we would like for you to consider is, what do you foresee as being the greatest barriers districts will face during reopening when considering exceptional learners and preschool students? And what suggestions do you have for overcoming these barriers? Next slide, please. So some overarching considerations that I would just like for you to be thinking about as you hear additional information shared today. As we think about students with IEPs, particularly, it's very important for us to consider that we continue to offer a full free appropriate public education, or FAPE, while keeping in mind that FAPE may look very different in a virtual environment. And one of the questions that we're beginning to see come up right now is around location or placement. If a district offers a virtual instructional model through NTI, then does that equate into a change of placement under the IDEA? And the short answer to that is no. Location is not the same as placement. Placement is based on individual student needs and the least restrictive environment for the student. There's also some questions with regard to FAPE. If districts are required to continue specially designed instruction and or related services, we're hearing those things, and the answer to that is yes. If a student qualifies for special education and is receiving specially designed instruction and related services, both must be continued. But as we think about the offer of FAPE, it may look different in a virtual environment. For example, a student may be receiving more intense services and less frequent services in a virtual environment because it would be one-to-one versus less intensity, more frequency in a collaborative setting. But it's important for the ARC teams to convene to make those decisions and to be able to communicate with parents and families what offer of FAPE is being provided to students. Probably the most challenging aspect of all of this is going to be ensuring enough time for teachers and related service providers and others to ensure that FAPE is provided. So the level of FTE, particularly for those districts that are offering hybrid models, may get very difficult, and scheduling may become quite cumbersome. But again, it's important to try to do those scheduling conflicts on the front end so that we can ensure that all students are provided with a FAPE so that we don't have to have the conversations around compensatory education that Sylvia will be diving a little deeper into. So I am, and again, the last bullet there is about districts must continue to meet their maintenance of effort requirements. And that's the piece that the commissioner was talking about that Chris Thacker often shares. Basically, what we're advising districts in this area is that while it may be tempting to use CARES funding for the special education and related services moving forward, it's important for directors of special education and finance officers to work together to ensure that districts continue to meet the MOE requirements or maintenance of effort under the IDEA, because failing to do so could jeopardize some funding in the future. And as we move forward, we have a great team in our office that work one-to-one with directors of special ed and finance officers to work through that. So should districts have questions, they're encouraged to contact us to talk through those. Next slide, please. All right, so this is where I will stop and turn it over to Veronica Sullivan to talk to you about the contents of the guidance document.
Thank you, Greta. Good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to provide you with an overview of the document that was released last week. That document, it aligns with our flagship document or our Healthy at Schools document. So once that document was released, we began to get multiple questions about how do we apply the information in that document to students with disabilities, and that's when the exceptional learner and preschool document was developed based on those questions. So they're designed to work together as a supplement. And today I'm just going to go over one section, which is our largest section of the document. There are 4 sections. Reopening considerations is the largest section, but the document also includes special education and preschool question and answers, as well as resources. Next slide. When talking about exceptional learners, we're talking about, just to be clear, students with disabilities or IEPs, students with a 504 plan, and gifted and talented students. The first section I'm going to highlight for you here is social distancing. And within that section, there is information about differentiating instruction for exceptional learners when teaching social distancing, and it gives some examples of things to do in order to prompt students to follow social distancing. The next area I'm going to talk about is what to do when students require staff proximity closer than 6 feet. As many of you know, some students with complex needs may require one-to-one assistance. This would be outlined in their IEP, and they need services that will require staff and students to be closer than 6 feet. And within that area of the document, we provide examples on things like assistance with hand overhand instruction, physical transferring, feeding students, or physical restraint if that's necessary to protect the safety of students and others. In those cases where you can't socially distance, it's important that you utilize appropriate PPE. So we talk about some examples of what PPE to use. It is not an all-inclusive list or an all-inclusive scenario or information. There's information that districts may have that's even more creative than we were able to be. So just keep in mind, these are just examples and not things that necessarily is an exhaustive list. So in that section, we talk about face shields. There's been a lot of question about face shields. And based on the information that we have been provided through CDC and our flagship document, face shields alone do not provide enough protection. So they will need to wear a cloth face mask as well as a face shield when they're doing things like feeding a student or changing a student. But what we do want is for schools and districts to really think about the individual needs of the students and consult with their local health department on those students and what they may need for PPE. Another section that we talk about in here is preschool and social distancing within the classroom. So there was a document that was sent out for facilities and logistics. And within that document, that was released on June 29th. Within that document, there's a calculator. And we have encouraged districts to utilize that calculator to determine how you social distance within the classroom for those preschool students. So how many students can actually fit into a classroom based on square footage. The other area I want to talk about a little bit is special transportation. So there are some districts who are considering parents who may transport their children. If a student has special transportation or the T5 code in Infinite Campus listed and they have that as a related service in their IEP, there are certain provisions that the district will have to take to ensure that those parents are reimbursed for those costs related to transporting that student. So it goes through that in the document as well. And we talk about food preparation and snacks. That's activity that typically will happen in a preschool setting. And there may be students who have a 504 plan or an IEP who will have food and drink indicated on their plans or their program, and they will need that regardless of what the district puts in place for food and snacks. Like one example would be if they decide that there will be no food or drink on the bus, but a student requires that based on their IEP, then that student would need to be provided that snack or drink, and staff would need to be made aware of that. And then we talk about instructional experiences in the community. And what we're talking about here is community-based instruction and gifted and talented. And rather than amending IEPs or amending gifted student service plans, we talk about having districts really think about virtual options as temporary alternatives to providing that type of instruction to students. Next slide. And Greta talked about, she touched on least restrictive environment. And again, we encourage districts to look at that particular section when thinking about what constitutes a change of placement or a location change. So that section will go into that, as well as really thinking about, in a small number of cases, there may be students where long-term remote instruction may have caused a need for an ARC to occur to really discuss the change in their least restrictive environment. And then we go into cloth face coverings. And according to the Healthy at Schools document, students who are enrolled in first grade and above should be wearing masks, which would mean our younger students, including preschool, kindergarten age students, may not be required to wear a mask. And but I do want to clarify that majority of students with disabilities should be able to adhere to the mask wearing policies. But there may be a small percentage of students that will not be able to. So we talk in the document about what to do if a district is presented with a medical waiver for those students. And really, it's important that that's implemented immediately. You don't have to have an ARC meeting if the parent presents with a notice from their medical professional for that student not to wear a mask. But again, this is a small percentage of students, and we go through that in the document as well. Then we talk about considerations under health policies. So things we ask districts to be mindful of is when you're doing health screenings and signing up your practices for health screenings, temperature checks, just to really think about those students with disabilities and those young preschool students and what's developmentally appropriate for wait time, or what they can tolerate if there are students with disabilities, and just have plans in place for those particular populations of students so that you're able to smoothly get students into the building. We also talk about ways to administer eligibility assessments and identification to multiple students. Often multiple students may use one test booklet, for example. So there may be a few copies of a particular test booklet that multiple students may touch. So we give a scenario or example of that, of what to do with that, to leave those test booklets out, don't put them in a stack, that type of information, to leave it for about 24 hours. If they're using computers, to wipe those computer boards down between students, just information about those type of practices. And then we talk about preschool centers, where preschool students will not be required to wear a mask. It's really important that they practice social distancing and that we're really thinking about how we utilize centers in those classrooms. So there is a list of ideas on how to do that. Again, it's not exhaustive. It's just some starting points, and educators are very creative. They're going to come up with better scenarios or more scenarios than we have. We just wanted to provide something so that people could get started and really think about that. And then the last section I'm going to talk about is thinking about contact tracing. We have a lot of students who receive related services, for example, for students with disabilities, or we have teachers who may travel from classroom to classroom or building to building. And within that section, it really talks about how you design a system to document how adults are moving within classroom, or potentially how students are moving within the classroom. Next slide. So again, just to pose our guiding question, what do you foresee as being the greatest barriers districts will face during reopening when considering exceptional learners? That's students with IEPs, students with 504 plans, and gifted students, and our preschool students. And then what suggestions do you have for overcoming these barriers? Next slide. If you have questions that you don't have today necessarily that we can answer for you, please feel free to reach out to me. Veronica Sullivan, that's my contact information. You can also contact Carol Ann Morrison if you have questions as well. Do we have any questions?
And again, this is not just questions, but feedback that you may have about this guidance document. Feel free to put that in the chat, or feel free to speak up. All right. Thank you all for your update on this area.
Okay. Sylvia?
I'll move on to the next one then. So the next guidance document that OCL has put out is the considerations for reopening schools, and it really talks about the differences for compensatory education and extended school year services. So today I'm going to go through that with you a little bit, and we'll talk about the document. The guiding question for this section is what supports will need, I apologize, there's a fire department going by right now. What supports will districts need when determining compensatory education and extended school year services for students? When you look at the compensatory education and ESY document, you'll see that it's broken down into 4 sections. The first section is about free appropriate public education, or FAPE, during remote instruction. The second section is all about compensatory education. The third section is really about extended school year services. And then there's a question and answers section as well. Additionally, within that document, you'll see that there's a couple of added features, like there's a 1-page document that talks about important things to remember. There's also a side-by-side that really kind of talks about the differences between the two. What we've seen is that there's a lot of conversation about them, and sometimes the two things get confused. And so we were hoping that if we could put it side by side with you all, for you guys, that would help with that issue. So let's talk about a little bit about FAPE. So it's important to remember that regardless of the instructional delivery model, local school districts remain responsible providing FAPE to students with disabilities. So whether it's in person, hybrid, all virtual, all of those things will, they're still required to provide FAPE. As a result of the inability to provide face-to-face instruction, there may be some certain special education or related services that are difficult or even impossible to provide during times of remote instruction. An example of when this could happen includes things like orientational and mobility services, which are typically provided in a face-to-face environment and would need hands-on interaction between a provider and the student. When special education and related services are not provided in accordance with what's written on the IEP, regardless of why, it could result in a denial of FAPE. And the remedy for failing to provide FAPE is compensatory education. And the goal of compensatory education is really not to punish districts. It's just to place students in the position that he or she would have otherwise been in had there not been a denial of FAPE. A little bit, one of the most popular conversations really in this, it's very controversial. There's a lot of questions about the terminology and what do we call it when these things happen. There's a whole lot of different ways that people have taught. We've heard things all the way from compensatory education to unfinished learning, recovery services, post-COVID instruction. We really discourage districts from shying away from using the terminology compensatory education. However, there may be times that staff just don't feel comfortable using that language. And if that's the case, that's okay. But if they do use that alternate language, then it's important to acknowledge that any kind of services that are designed to place a student in a position that he or she would have otherwise been in, but for the lack of educational benefit resulting from a denial of FAPE, is actually still compensatory education. So when we talk about compensatory education, it's really not defined. You're not going to find it in the Kentucky Administrative Regulations. It's actually defined by case law. And like we said earlier, punishment of the local district is not the purpose of compensatory education. It's typically awarded as the result of an IDEA dispute or as a voluntary remedy by a student's admissions and release committee. Compensatory education awards are reviewed on a case-by-case basis, and those awards must be reasonably calculated to provide educational benefit and can extend a student's eligibility beyond graduation or age 21. However, it would not include any kind of repayment for post-secondary instruction. When we talk about extended school year services, it actually is defined in the KARs. And it's defined as specially designed instruction and related services that are provided to a student with a disability beyond the normal school year in accordance with the child's IEP at no cost to the parent. There's also some case law that goes around it. There's one of the most relevant cases is the Kenton County versus Hunt case, and it actually uses a quote from Cordry versus Euchert. And so we've got both of those in front of you. But, Cordry versus Euchert really discussed about how in order to establish that extended school year services are necessary to provide a student with a FAPE, it's incumbent upon those proposing an ESY for inclusion in the IEP to demonstrate in a particularized manner related to the individual child that ESY is necessary to avoid something more than adequately recoupable of regression. More specifically, it must be shown that ESY is necessary to permit the child to benefit from instruction. So when we think about those things and you apply that into the Kenton County case, it really talked about how ARCs must consider the student's tendency to regress, their prior regression, their ability to recoup lost skills, and any kind of progress that they're making towards their educational goals. It's going to be important to remember that nearly all students regress after a summer or extended breaks, but not all students with disabilities will qualify for ESY. Typically, the students who qualify for ESY have a likelihood of significant regression, very slow recoupment. ARCs are responsible for planning the type, the location, and the amount of the services that are to be provided to the student. Those decisions have to be made by the ARC on a case-by-case basis. And it's really important to remember that local school districts cannot limit the provision of extended school year services to specific categories of disabilities, or do like blanket, times or durations of those services. They really have to be individualized based on the need of the student. Like we said before, once you look at that document, you'll also see that it then goes into the side-by-side, and then following that, you'll see a one-pager that are important things to remember. I'd encourage you to share those with, your ARC chairs and teachers to help them really see the differences, especially since it's just a one-page easy thing. And then following that, there are two different sections of question and answers. One really just discusses all kinds of answers regarding to compensatory education. The other will discuss questions related to extended school year. So in thinking about that, I just wanted to remind you all of our guiding question and ask you, what supports do you think that districts will need when they're determining compensatory education and extended school year services for students? If you think of anything after, feel free to contact me. My name is Sylvia Starkey, and my contact information is on there. And you can also contact Caroline Morrison, who is the policy advisor in OCL. But I'll wait to see if you all have any questions.
There's a question in the chat or a comment. I think it's a good one. And Greta, you may want to address this regarding the negative connotation around compensatory education, and then obviously that coming as a result of something we all had to do with remote learning because of the pandemic. You want to talk a little bit about about that?
Yeah, sure. Nancy, that is a really good question, and it's really the topic of conversation across the nation right now. We actually had this conversation with the National Association of State Directors, the NASD group, and the conversation really is around, I think Case issued a white paper, if you will, saying just exactly what you're saying. And I totally understand why they were saying this, is that when we use the term compensatory education, it feels like a negative word, and that the district did something wrong or harmed a student by their actions. However, I will say that COPA, which is a group of advocates and attorneys, issued a scathing response to the letter, basically saying that, don't shy away from calling it what it is, because it indeed is compensatory education. There's also been some briefs in Special Education Connections, the LRP group, if you've subscribed to those, just recently with Jose Martin and some other special education attorneys across the nation, providing the guidance to not shy away from it. And in OCL, we followed up with OSEP, looked at their guidance. They are also referring to this as comp ed. So we continued in line with that, because I think what we need to really do as we're thinking about this is, one of two things is going to happen here. Either we're going to call it what it is, which is really compensatory education, and try to educate people that comp ed is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's just saying, look, this is where we would have been otherwise, and it's not the fault of the district or the fault of anyone else that this pandemic occurred, and it stinks, but it is the services that we provide to students to put them back where they would have otherwise been, because we were unable to provide that. And it just is a more transparent, honest conversation with parents, versus if we call these recovery services, it masks the reality of what actually happened. Because and if I'm a parent, I would much rather a district just level with me and say, look, there are certain services we're not going to be able to provide because it's not in the best interest of during a public health crisis. However, when this is over, we're going to keep a log of that and we're going to provide compensatory services, which doesn't equal negative or bad or that I did anything wrong, just that we're going to voluntarily do that. Because should the district and the parent go into a dispute resolution, the remedy for failing to provide FAPE, regardless of the cause, is compensatory education. So if the district has already offered those comp ed and acknowledged the non-compliance, then there's really not much left to do. And so it could save the district quite a bit in legal fees. And that's my non-legal answer. Does that help at all? Or does it just muddy things up a little bit?
Yes,
Thank you.
and Nancy, thank you for raising that. I think that's on the minds of everyone.
Agree.
Any other questions, comments, feedback? If you think of something, feel free to place that in the chat as we move forward. Next, we have Robin Kinney and Lauren Moore to discuss the various waivers from the U.S. Department of Agriculture regarding food service programs. Robin and Lauren.
Thank you, Kevin, and it's a pleasure to be online with each of you again today. Lauren Moore, our Division Director for School and Community Nutrition, is going to be handling most of this presentation along with her staff. As we continue to work through issues related to reopening of schools, if you can recall back on June 22nd, the department through this Division of School and Community Nutrition released some guidance on how to reopen with your USDA school meal programs. And since that time, and in that guidance, we've focused primarily on in-person instruction and having students in your building. Today's presentation, we're going to focus more on the remote food service. So our guiding question, and this is somewhat based upon additional waivers that have been granted by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but our guiding question today is, what supports can school and community nutrition provide to assist school districts with remote food service for the upcoming school year? And I'm going to turn it over to Lauren and let her walk you through the waivers and what that means as far as providing those important nutritional services.
I'm in a virtual meeting.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please.
Meeting, and I got another one at 3:30. It's just a Monday.
Melody, can you go to the next slide, please?
I have advanced the slides.
Thank
Sometimes
you.
it's
There's a
just
delay.
slow.
Yeah, thank you so much. So as Robin was saying, the Division of School and Community Nutrition released guidance in June that addressed in-person food service. And shortly after that time, the United States Department of Agriculture released waivers that allow the department and others, they're nationwide waivers that allow for feeding of students in remote situations. In response to those waivers, we have released another guidance document today that you can find on the KDE website relating to remote food service. Next slide, please. So the waivers granted by the USDA will be listed on the next slide. They are effective through June 30th, 2021. Katie Embry is our school's program manager. She's going to go through those in a little more detail. I do want to point out that these waivers are a substantial change from the way school districts fed students beginning in mid-March through authority granted by the USDA at that time. In the spring, districts were using summer feeding programs. Those programs provide meals at no cost to children ages 18 and under. And the meal service that the USDA has given the authority to administer for the upcoming school year are our school meal programs. You're probably familiar with the National School Lunch Program and school breakfast programs. A few important distinctions between these programs, other than what I just mentioned, which is the summer programs are available at no cost to all children ages 18 and under. These programs are based upon eligibility for the students. So this is when you hear about free, reduced, and paid students, those free, reduced, paid eligibility status will come into play for this. There's also another distinction. Of course, we have a lot of school districts in Kentucky who provide meals at no cost. That's through the Community Eligibility Provision Program. However, a challenge that our districts are going to face using the school meal programs is also being able to identify each child as they receive a meal. So we are aware and understand that this is creating substantial challenges for our food service departments. There are many organizations also advocating for additional flexibilities beyond these waivers to mitigate these challenges and also the financial impact that we know our food service programs are facing. We are supportive of additional flexibilities and options for our school districts, and we're currently working to submit state waivers to the USDA to lessen these burdens. Waiver requests, when we submit state waiver requests, those are posted on the KDE website. They are made public, of course, through that website. And we also send to food service directors every Monday, we send a weekly update email. So we always share those state waiver requests with them so that we can see what type of efforts we are undertaking in order to assist them with the challenges they're faced with. Next slide, please. So back to our guidance that was issued today. So which child nutrition programs do we use for NTI meal service? So as we stated in June, we talked about in-person. So now we're looking at how do we provide meals to students who are not physically in the school building? So there are multiple different methods laid out here. So a planned school day is any type of instruction taking place. So whether a child would be in person, receiving in-person instruction, or a non-traditional instruction day is used, that is, those meals will be served through the National School Lunch and School Breakfast programs. If there is a planned closure, a true school closure, where there is no in-person or NTI instruction taking place, such as weekends or holidays or other planned closures, spring breaks, things like that, no meal services are available through any child nutrition programs, and that's not, that is how the child nutrition programs typically work. So for unanticipated school closures, that is when there is a planned school day was canceled due to some reason. So we have sought guidance from the USDA about what should we do in this case. We do know that there may be, even though our calendars are, we're working to set those school calendars, there could be some situations where we truly do have to cancel classes, not just transition from in-person to remote, but we may truly have to have a closure. So we have sought guidance on that answer, and we'll have that to the food service directors soon. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Katie Embry, our schools manager, to discuss a little bit more in depth the waivers that we have in place currently.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Again, I want to reiterate that I'm going to talk about program requirements and opportunities that you have as of today. So we all know things are ever changing. So if additional flexibilities are released, we will be sure to change our course and get that information to you. But there's still program integrity requirements based with the waivers that are out now. The waivers provide schools the flexibility to serve meals to their enrolled students outside of the traditional school setting, or what we refer to as NTI. These waivers do not allow schools to serve those meals through community feeding program models, as such what that occurred back in March at the beginning of the pandemic. Unless specifically addressed in guidance, the program requirements of the National School Lunch and Breakfast programs apply to the meals served to enrolled students that are receiving instruction due to COVID-19 on NTI days. Schools must notify SCN of requests to use these waivers and receive approval. Food service directors have been communicated this information, and we are processing requests daily. So now let's talk about some meal service models that you can use with non-traditional instruction. There are multiple meal service models that schools can operate when using the non-congregate and meal service time waivers. We will discuss meal pickup services, sending meals home with students, and meal delivery to bus stops or households. The first one that we're going to talk about is meal pickup services. Next slide, please. Not sure if there's just the delay or not.
It's Katie, there's just a delay. I might try to
Sorry.
unshare if it doesn't pop up.
Okay. Meal pickup services are when schools operate and they want to provide a meal to a parent or to guardians or directly to the child. So it's when meals can be picked up at the school and taken home by a parent or guardian, and you'll need a waiver if you do that if the child is not present, or provided directly to the student. Schools must have a method to count these meals by individual student, collect payments when applicable, and include internal control processes that would prevent duplicate meals from being provided. Schools should use distribution methods or strategies that maintain social distancing and avoid the formation of groups or lines. Best practices include a drive-through style meal pickup or staggered pickup times. Also, food safety and sanitation standard operating procedures for cleaning, sanitizing services, hand washing, employee health should be followed by all staff who are distributing the meals. And parents or guardians and students should be reminded not to come to the distribution site if they are sick or have any concerns about the virus. The second method that we can talk about is sending meals home with students. This is where meals can be provided to students on an in-person instruction day to take home for consumption for the following day or days during non-traditional instruction. Again, schools must have a method to count meals by the individual student, collect payments when applicable, and include internal controls that would prevent duplication. Program operators must also take into consideration food safety instructions or food safety considerations to make sure that the meals go home are held safely for those students and can be consumed later. The last type of method is meal delivery services. This is where schools have the option to use their school buses on their normal bus routes to deliver meals and serve at bus stops or deliver directly to households. If this option is selected, delivering meals directly to the household would require the schools to obtain written permission from the households prior to delivering meals. There would also, again, need to be a process to count the meals served to individual students and marked off when the meals are provided. Again, duplication is a concern that every meal goes to an enrolled student and the student receives one meal per meal service. Lastly, we want to address two frequently asked questions. We've received these questions from multiple districts over the course of the last few weeks. So the first one is a school district required to provide meals to students receiving non-traditional instruction due to COVID-19? Meaning, do you have to opt into the non-congregate and meal service times waivers to provide to students who are not who are receiving instruction not in the school building? At this point, we do not have a clear answer to this question. We've submitted it to USDA, and we are very hopeful that we will receive guidance in the very near future. The second question is, can the district provide meal service during unanticipated closures when no instruction is taking place? And again, as Lauren spoke to this earlier, we do not have a clear answer to this, and we are consulting with USDA and hope to have information soon. Are there any questions that we can answer for you at this time?
All right, thank you. If anyone has questions, comments, feel free to place those in the chat. I do want to defer and recognize our Lieutenant Governor, who has been able to join us, and she may not be able to stay on due to her schedule. So, Lieutenant Governor Coleman, do you have a few words for us?
Yes, thank you so much, Kevin. I just wanted to come on and thank everyone for all of the work that you all have been doing. We have been working in less than ideal circumstances with a moving target, and you guys have answered the call at every turn. The Department of Education continues to be on the forefront of working with our Department of Public Health, providing the most up-to-date information and recommendations to our schools based on changing circumstances. And so I want to thank you for everything that you have done. I mean, this group has gone above and beyond, and I'm so grateful to have all of you working together with us to move this state forward, especially in terms of what education is going to look like in the near future. So thank you all so much for everything that you're doing.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. And we also want to thank you for the partnership. And obviously, your expertise has been invaluable as we've navigated this throughout the past few months. Next, we have Dr. Marty Park to discuss the Online and Virtual Schools Network.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Brown. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you again. I greatly appreciate every time I get to join and share a little bit about the work that we're engaged in, especially when it comes to maximizing the use of digital resources and the technologies that we have available to us, especially during this time when we think we can continue to remove barriers for our students. So thank you so much. And, you know, I'm not going to share slides with you today. I just would like to talk through some work that we are currently engaged in that is rapidly picking up pace. We're working with local school districts. We're also working at regional levels with co-ops on this topic, and then all throughout the state with our extended partners to help develop some more efficient processes, but also some better experiences for our kids. And so the topic I wanted to share with you today, and the words virtual have actually been mentioned today quite a bit. And I started tally marks, and I decided to halt on that as I was, crossing many groups off. So, the words virtual mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Other words that we've seen and used, and we all are using them today: remote learning, distance learning, blended learning, virtual learning, and so digital learning. All of these words are meaning quite a bit to not just our teachers or from a leadership level, but also our families and our parents. And so I wanted to hone in on the idea of full-time enrollment in a virtual school. That's a bit different than what we have mentioned earlier with virtual learning or distance or remote learning strategies. And so we're further defining, and it's important that we all kind of come together with some shared understanding that full-time virtual enrollment in a school or virtual school or a virtual academy is with students who are not assigned to that traditional classroom, in-person classroom teacher. Okay, and so all across the state, when we look at our landscape, we see rapid development here, and we want to help from a statewide perspective. We know that in Kentucky we scale extremely fast and we scale at high quality, and we want to continue that, especially when it comes to full-time enrollment in virtual schools. So in 2012, we officially closed our virtual doors of the Kentucky Virtual High School, and as I've shared before with other groups, we were a leading state in the development of one of the first ever across the nation virtual high schools. We ran and operated that from the Kentucky Department of Education, as many of you are aware and participated in probably. And that was the right answer at the right time, but we quickly got to a point where our districts were providing services that matched or were a better solution in many cases than for the Department of Ed to run a virtual school. We still see in other states where some other states are running virtual schools, but it's important to understand where we are in Kentucky, where and I'm thankful I have my virtual background setting here. So it's important for us to recognize where we are in our state. We believe that we can expand our virtual schools across the state in the right way with high quality. And we can do that with our school district partners, our regional partners, our education cooperatives, and our technology partners as well. So I want to dig into a few things. Number one, when we think about an online and virtual schools network across the state, and we think about that expansion and what that can look like, it's important to understand that programmatically or structurally, that can be an A5 program. And so that's an alternative based program that many districts across the state already have set up. It also can be an embedded academy model, if you will, a virtual academy model that Mr. Cook mentioned earlier just a bit ago. It could be a virtual academy model that is embedded into an existing A1 school. And so think of school within a school or that academy approach to a virtual school. At each district level, it's important to understand what the right approach is. And we will see some school districts who will have both. They'll have some embedded virtual full-time enrolled virtual academies where those students who are enrolled are not assigned traditional classroom teachers and traditional courses like other students are. So we'll see some districts who have both models, and we'll see districts who continue to select whether that A5 kind of approach, that program approach, is better or embedded in that existing. We also have defined what we are calling expanded enrollment in a full-time virtual school. And that expanded enrollment represents a district or even at a regional level where the district or a partner is accepting students through some kind of agreement. And in some districts, that's a reciprocal agreement. And today, as many of you are aware, we're working through interlocal agreements with education cooperatives like you online today. And so that interlocal agreement can be that agreement that looks at that expanded enrollment where it's not just inside of a school district or a school, and that it's expanded to kind of a broader perspective. Certainly, we have several models throughout the state that have proven very successful, but I wanted to just share a couple highlights to really pinpoint a couple things that I think are important to us. So many, if not all, of our online course content providers provide services to a variety of educational entities. I think that's important to understand. That can be public school districts. Some of the course providers or content providers also provide to private parochial schools, charter schools in some states, and also homeschools in a similar way that we're comfortable with textbook companies and other content providers. But so state regulations and guidelines and resources, as well as school and district level policies, empower districts the opportunity to vet online course content. That's important, and to assure full alignment with Kentucky academic standards, which we're driving in on high quality online teaching pedagogy with leadership and governance wrapped all around for course student progress and achievement. And that's important to understand that when we talk about full-time virtual school enrollment, which again is a bit different than some blended or remote learning strategies with our existing classroom teachers, our traditional in-person classroom teachers. It's important for all of us to drive in on that. We're not talking about just sticking kids on a program or behind a screen and hoping that great things happen. There's a lot that goes into making sure that students progress and achieve at high levels. And so it's important for us to go a little bit deeper. And so I wanted to make like 3 quick points here. Curriculum and course content cannot be endorsed by KDE or recommended by KDE. That's important to remember. Local schools and districts have total latitude in determining that who the content providers are. Of course, we need at the district level or regional level, we need legal purchasing vehicles. And there's no statewide contract for online and virtual school content or platforms. Nor, and I'd like to point this out, there's also it's important to note that there's also no statewide contract for a learning management system. So all that said, digital platforms can certainly offer as instruction, if you will. So like think about the platform is the teacher. So What that means to us, though, in Kentucky, because we have some great structures in place, is that it must have instruction aligned to Kentucky academic standards. That's important to us. And courses must be properly reviewed and endorsed. We love that push on that word endorsed by a Kentucky certified teacher. This is usually out of district, in district, but it definitely should be content specific. And so think of a course, and that could be K through 12, which is another strong decision point that we're working with districts on, and even at a regional level, is are you targeting in your full-time enrolled virtual school or academy, are you targeting 9 through 12? Are you targeting 6 through 12? Or are you targeting K through 12 with content that's appropriate? And so that should be, that content should be reviewed and endorsed by content specific Kentucky certified teachers. When we think about teachers of record, when receiving instruction through like in online platforms, this is the person who's administering the course, if you will, the teaching and learning. That's the teacher of record. It must be like through Infinite Campus course setup, we would identify with online instruction. That becomes really important to us when we set up. David Cook mentioned earlier, and I want to call back out that it's really important for us right now when we establish full-time enrolled virtual schools and academies that we still focus and target that participation component. So we want to avoid, in this case, if we can. Now, we don't want to avoid it if it's the right fit, but many times what we're talking about is not really performance-based. So we want to avoid that performance-based approach, because if it's set as performance-based, then that's absent the opportunity to use the participation measures, if you will. Okay, and then finally, when we think about the resources that we have available to us, and I mentioned that it's important for us in Kentucky, because we scale fast and we scale at high quality with things like this, that we have a ton of guidelines for us. We have a ton of what I refer to sometimes as kind of architecture or blueprints. So we have our Kentucky Digital Learning Guidelines. It's important to make sure that we're fresh on those, and when we're setting this work up across the board, that we gear towards those digital learning guidelines. And there's 5 really simple guiding principles there. We have our Kentucky Digital Curriculum Guidance that we've issued, and we can help pull together district by district or at a regional level. We have our online state course code database that helps us in this space quite a bit. We have our Kentucky Academic Standards, certainly. We have our Model Curriculum Framework, which helps us. And we have instructional resource alignment rubrics that are very helpful to us. But I also want to point out from a administrative regulation perspective or a statute perspective that we do have statute that digs in pretty quickly that a public charter school shall not be a virtual public charter school. And I point that out because it's important for us to understand where we're coming from on this. When we establish a full-time enrolled virtual academy, we're adhering to the things that we know is next practice and best practice, right? We're adhering to all of the work that we've all invested in at the school and district level and at the regional leadership level. And so this is not a charter school conversation. This is very much about providing new experiences and opportunities for kids that are the right thing at the right time. We do see this work scaling beyond post-COVID, especially when implemented with high quality. And so what we're looking to do is to officially establish Kentucky K through 12 online and virtual schools network. And through the network, we'll continue to help our schools, districts, and regional leaders establish official public school and academies for full-time enrolled virtual work. But also we will be really targeting in on high quality, quality assurance at levels that we're aware of no other state has really mastered. And so we want to ensure that students are making progress and that are connected to Kentucky certified teachers the best that we can and move forward. So our our guiding question for today was very direct. And so we're talking about urgent design strategies here and decision points. And so for full-time enrolled virtual school students, what are the urgent design strategies that we need to work through and get through that you're aware of? We're aware of quite a bit. But also, how are these strategies different than the hybrid blended approaches or the, and David Cook and I talk about this all the time, but the traditional NTI day kind of approaches? How are those strategies a bit different? So Commissioner Brown, thanks for again the opportunity, and I love to open up and discuss or review questions that come in.
We have some comments you may want to address over in the chat. A good conversation going.
Yeah.
Marty, do you want to read those out loud, or would you like me to read those for you? You're on mute, Marty.
Yeah, I was just joking about that. No, I can use my best radio voice here and read. So Eric Kennedy, great point, great statement. If local board created procedures such as a program, and then it wouldn't be a charter school at all, and that's absolutely correct. That's definitely in line with the current practices and thinking. A lot of great opportunity for interlocal agreements and use of co-ops to lead this work. Share economies of scale, absolutely. That's one of the driving points by us officially establishing a statewide network, and also leaning and heavily investing further into our partners. We're all have a partnership developed that's working extremely well, including local school districts as well. And we all know the Barron County Bavel Academy, which is our longest serving online and virtual academy that is of extremely high quality. And so we continue to point to the leaders in the space across the state to expand. This could maximize our course offerings, absolutely, given the teacher shortage, even before and after COVID ends. Yeah, so great points, Eric. I appreciate that. And that feeds into all of the reasons why this makes sense. And we've been working on this for quite some time. We actually have about a year and a half or 2 years been working to develop what our K through 12 online and virtual schools network can look like in Kentucky. And the picture becomes a lot clearer now. But we're over capacity right now for students who need these experiences and opportunities, and working to fit that need is where we are right now across the state, I believe. And I will say thank you to our co-op leaders who are pushing this conversation hard as well. We have some great leadership throughout the state, and I think we're going to have, if I were to predict, I would say, and I don't think it's too bold to say, but I think we'll have one of the best online and virtual public school offerings across the country when we fully get to capacity.
All right, thank you. Dr. Park, thank you for being with us. And if you can stay on, we may have some additional questions through chat or at the very end.
Absolutely, glad to.
Next, we have Rob Akers with the office. Rob?
Yeah, there we go. Lost you there for a second. Good afternoon, everybody. Commissioner Brown, thanks for the opportunity to share with folks. One of the big things we've been working on in the Office of Educator Licensure and Effectiveness is trying to determine what flexibilities our districts are going to need as we get into trying to staff a school post-COVID. And so our guiding question is, what flexibilities currently exist related to teacher certification? And as I read the rest of it, and teacher of record and or permissions based on needs for implementing return to school plans, what additional certification or permissions and flexibilities need to be considered by the EPSB. I'm going to share my screen with you. All right. Are we showing?
We can see your screen.
Great, thank you. I knew Marty would be the one to let me know. Okay, so as we get into our discussion here today, some considerations. We know that as our district leaders prepare to safely reopen school, we're going to have to take some precautions to get people back in person. And that's going to necessitate some flexibility for staffing and assignment of teachers. And we're going to try to go over a couple of the common scenarios today to share some information about what flexibility already exists within the statutes and regulations. We understand that there's probably going to be a need for us to appeal to the EPSB for further waivers of regulation, but we wanted to go over what we have that exists already with you to find out if there are some additional flexibilities that we need to advocate for coming up. And then, as you've heard so many times already today, there's basically three scenarios for returning to school. We've got in-person, Marty, get ready to tick this off, virtual, and hybrid. And each of those scenarios are going to present their own unique needs for flexibility. And just as I get into this, let me preface to say, as a former school administrator who spent almost 20 years trying to open school with master scheduling, hiring and assignment of staff, it was always a challenge without COVID. And so please know that you have a very empathetic person, a very empathetic office trying to work with the districts to get them all the flexibility that they need moving forward. So first, we'll look at one of the easier scenarios out there, and that's around the digital learning provider. And really, districts can use a digital learning provider to deliver content. And if they're using a platform such as an Apex, Edgenuity, Odyssey, etc., then any certified teacher can serve as the teacher of record. And this is important for the scenarios where you have a teacher who is at high risk for contracting COVID and then complications from COVID. And say that teacher just cannot come into work in a building, but you know that you have enough students who are at home online that you need a teacher of record for, and you have the program pre-purchased that the teacher is just simply serving as the facilitator of that content. That gives you that flexibility. Now, just understand that in this scenario, the teacher of record cannot be a substitute or an instructional aid. It has to be an actual certified teacher, but it can be any certified teacher. So if you, for example, had a high school math teacher and you needed someone to oversee an elementary, an intermediate grade online learning environment, you could have that high school teacher do that if the content was already developed and part of an already pre-approved curriculum program. Moving on, we have the teacher of record and additional instructor. And this is a scenario that I think is going to pop up quite a bit potentially in the middle and the high school environments. With this, you have to be a certified teacher and you have to be fully certified in your content area to be the teacher of record. However, you can have another certified teacher, any certified teacher, who can serve as an additional instructor. And where you will see this, at least as we've kind of gamed this out, is probably, like I said, in the high school or middle school setting. But this is I'll give you an example, the one that we've been using most. So say that you have a high school with one physics teacher. There are 30 students assigned to that teacher, and you have the ability to only have 17 of those 30 kids in your classroom. And 25 of the kids are participating in person on a regular basis, and you have 5 who are working in the hybrid online environment at home. That leaves you, if my math is right, with about 8 kids who still need support. And this would give you the ability to assign another teacher as the additional instructor to provide content support in another room, potentially at the same time that the teacher of record is still working with the other 17 students in their classroom. I think that we're going to see this especially in schools where we have limited amounts of teachers in a certain content area. If maybe you don't have very large classrooms and you don't have a lot of students who are working to do the online instruction. I understand that somewhere, depending on where you are, 75% to 85% attendance is about the limit of effective social distancing in some classrooms. So that's a consideration that schools need to be aware of, and some flexibility that they may not be aware that they already have that exists in regulation. As we move over to course permissions, it's interesting and important to know that many certificates carry additional courses that they can teach. If you look at the presentation here, elementary and middle school certified teachers could teach reading in all grades. So if you needed to reallocate a teacher from an elementary to teach Read 180 or some other specified reading courses at the high school, you could certainly do that. And you see there's some other flexibilities involved there. We also have a link to the certification reference guide that really gets into deep detail about all the different certification codes and cross permissions that are offered there as well. And so we hope that schools will pay close attention to those certificates and look at what those options are that they may not be aware of. One thing we think we're going to see quite a bit of is a need for districts and schools to have teachers who are teaching up and down grade levels. There's not currently a ton of flexibility within this, but there is a little bit, and we'll go over that real quickly. Your elementary teachers with grades 1 through 8 certification can teach obviously subjects all the way up to grade 8. Your K4s and P5s can teach up to 6th grade if the 6th grade is housed in the physical same building. Middle schoolers, teachers with a 5 to 8 certificate can teach 4th and 5th grade combined and can teach certain courses through 9th grade. And secondary teachers with older certification codes, the 7 through 12 certificate, can teach down to 6th grade if the 6th grade is housed in the same building as the 7th grade. So I anticipate that we'll be working with some districts around some requests and some potential waivers around extending those certification permissions in content areas. The HQ certification is a holdover from the old NCLB days where all teachers had to be highly qualified in most areas. And what that allows us to do is to extend certification and endorsements to teachers who meet certain conditions. You can see the content areas that are listed here: English, math, science, foreign language, social studies, and health and PE. It's really of most use at the middle and high school for extending certificates to different levels as well. 1-year certificate option for fully certified teachers who meet the requisite points, because it's kind of a checklist with certain points that you accrue with experience, professional learning, transcript review, and praxis assessments. Interestingly, though, for this next year, because of the EPSB's actions at the April 13th EPSB meeting, if a fully certified teacher meets the requisite 45 points through a combination of coursework, experience, professional learning, and only lacks successful completion of the praxis, the teacher may be issued a 1-year certificate to teach in that new area. Because ETS had so much trouble with closures for testing sites for praxis, the EPSB waived praxis requirements for the next year, and that also applies to those folks who are seeking HQ certification. So say, for example, you end up with a chemistry teacher who can't work in the building, or you see some need to get a biology teacher, and that's typically what your high schools find the most of, and that's typically what you find the largest amount of certified secondary science folks in the pool who are certified to teach. They could potentially go through the HQ process fairly easily, depending on their experience in courses, and be able to be fully certified for a year to teach additional coursework, whether it's chemistry or physics or some other science content. As always, there's still the ability to apply for emergency certification if a district is unable to secure what they determine to be a qualified teacher for a position. Then the district may request an emergency certificate for an individual to fill that position. And an emergency certificate is issued only for 1 year and is limited to the position in the district for which it is issued. However, the EPSB does consider waivers frequently for a second emergency for an issuance of an additional certificate. Those happen quite a bit, and we anticipate that we will continue to see several applications for extending emergencies in the coming year. So when we've exhausted all of our other means for being able to provide flexibility, the local school districts do have the ability to submit waiver requests to the EPSB, and that's something we'll have to primarily take on a case-by-case basis to work with the districts. We have excellent staff who are great in their knowledge of the law and will do everything they can to try to make the law work to the district's advantage so that we can help you hire the teachers and staff your buildings the way that you need. We have been in conversation with several of our partners. We've had some conversation with KEA, KSS, and some local districts who have large human resource departments, and just trying to game plan what the requests for flexibility will look like. We know that superintendents and principals are going to need greater flexibility to staff their schools. We know that teachers are going to do whatever it takes, as always, to step up to try to fill those gaps. We just want to make sure that we're able to provide flexibility that has the appropriate guide rails in place to protect our students and teachers. And at this point, would be very happy to take any questions or feedback or anything that's up for discussion. And in the presentation, we also have 3 different contacts for you to be able to reach out to if you need support.
Thank you, Rob. Great information. I'm getting some text messages about how this is very much appreciated. Maybe some questions. Anyone with questions, comments, feedback? And I know Rob, we're gonna have you do the same presentation tomorrow during the superintendent webcast. And I know that will be positively received as well.
All right, thank you, sir. If anything pops up, I'll still be on the meeting to try to answer any questions as they arise.
Thank you. Next, we have our traditional update from the Department of Public Health. We have Dr. White and I think Dr. Meserly. Dr. White, do you have any comments or just want to take questions and feedback?
Well, I do want to say that since the last time we talked, the CDC on the 24th of July came out with some updates on school openings and COVID-19. I have spoken with people here in the Department of Public Health and with some of your staff, so we're going to, after this meeting, hammer out a few details. We will do some updating, but it's nothing major. We're looking at temperatures and times, and talking about that you don't need a negative test to come back to school. And the third factor was that that we wanted to change this. That one of the symptoms was cough, and it was recommended by the CDC that we change that to a new cough because you have so many staff and students who have chronic medical conditions that cause coughing, and they were wanting to make sure that we weren't excluding people over and over again when it wasn't a COVID cough, but or a potential for a COVID cough. This was someone who had a chronic cough condition, and we don't want to just disrupt their lives for no reason, and so they recommended changing of that wording. So there was really not a lot of substantial changes, and we're going to create a document, just a one-page document to complement the flagship document, so that people can have the latest updated information from the CDC on that. So we are still looking at not only the CDC, but other organizations to try to be sure we're giving you the most updated and the best information. It's fluid. People are asking me a lot about long-term consequences of COVID-19. Well, it's only been in Kentucky since March, so we don't have any long-term information or long-term data. We can make guesses, but we really don't have anything that we feel comfortable sharing until we've got some good scientific basis to talk to you about. But we are looking at new information as it comes out, and we want to make sure that we change any documents to be sure that all of our Department of Education has the best, latest, and greatest information that's available.
Thank you, Dr.
Questions?
Yeah, any questions, feedback, comments? I also know we've been hearing some feedback from some districts regarding some minor conflicts between maybe healthy at work and healthy at school regarding employees. And I know we're working with public health on looking into those to see if those are in fact conflicts, and if so, if they need to be corrected. So you'll be hearing, if you're one of those districts or organizations that have had that question, you'll be hearing from us in the next few days to answer those.
And I think we're always going to err on what is the guideline that will make it most safe for your staff. That's what I think that we would lean on, and we would of course clear that with the Department of Education before we make any kinds of changes. This is a joint document, and it's not something that we just dream up. We want to make sure that our recommendations are something that fit into the Department of Education world. That's critical.
And I will, Dr. White, make just a kind of a general statement as to the meeting yesterday. Dr. White and I were able to attend the meeting with Dr. Burks. You may have seen that in the media. Dr. Burks, who is I think the co-chair of the White House COVID-19 task force, she's making her rounds through various mid-southern states. And the governor brought together individuals from public health, individuals from business and industry in the state, as well as post-secondary institutions with their various hospitals to have a discussion. And I'll state what was already in the press, but we are entering in what could be a very concerning time, because we're starting to have some indicators in Kentucky of an uptick in the percentage of case positivity being spread by asymptomatic carriers, and we're obviously seeing an increase and a spike and somewhat of a crisis of cases in our southern states on the coasts. We all know we've had friends and relatives, or we've seen on social media with Kentuckians that are traveling and going from state to state and coming back. And I think all of this is probably leading to the potential for an increase in Kentucky. And we all know over the last week we've seen an increase in cases. And so we need to pay attention to the governor's webcast, or press conference today. As I indicated in a letter to superintendents last week, needed everyone to be prepared to switch to a potential NTI instruction the first 2 weeks of August. That's a potential recommendation from the governor to not have in-person classes the first few weeks of August. That's a possibility. And I don't think that will affect many districts. However, I think most districts have scheduled their first day, whether that be in-person, NTI, or hybrid, in the last half of August or first part of September. So, but just everyone pay attention to the press conferences this week. And then obviously the governor has talked about last week other mitigation efforts that might have to be utilized as recommended by the CDC and the White House, just for our society in general, such as recommended by the White House, talking about closing of bars, reducing restaurant capacity, of course, mandatory masks. We heard from Dr. White yesterday that those three things are if they're implemented, are very effective. And if, that those are obviously on the table for Kentucky just because of the nature of where we are with the number of cases rising. So I want to give you all a little bit of just a summary of that in case you didn't see the media coverage. We were very pleased that Dr. Burks took time to come to Kentucky. She was doing a tour of all of the mid-southern states. She was very down to earth, and she actually stopped, I believe, at the Frankfurt Walmart and the Frankfurt Kroger to try to find disinfectant wipes because she can't get those in DC. So if you saw someone with a scarf on at the Frankfurt Walmart yesterday, it could have actually been Dr. Burks. You were not seeing things.
Well, and the point that she made that we had already found out, we've had 6 weeks of increasing numbers. We've had a gradual increase in our positivity. These are the very same things that Florida and Texas and Arizona saw. Gradual increasing, clusters of travel and some businesses. Their hospitals were handling everything. And then all of a sudden, they had that exponential rise. And so she is in Indiana, Ohio. She left us to go to Tennessee, and then she was going to drive up to Virginia just to make that plea with everybody that you're not cruising right now. This is very likely the calm before the storm, which is why we have the mandatory mask ordinance. Today will be right at a good 2-week period of time where we would expect to start to see that ordinance make a difference. Now, they do on the second floor all the calculating, so I have no insight as to what the number is going to be today. But that number is going to be a real pivotal number as the governor considers making some changes. I will have to say, in my past, when you said the word pivot, I immediately thought of basketball. I married my husband for Up Arena tickets, so I'm a big basketball person. But for the rest of my life, when I say the word pivot, I'm going to be thinking of the Department of Education from now on, because you folks, it's a position you're in to make these tremendous decisions on a dime, and for the protection of your staff and your students. And I don't envy the position you're in, but I have more and more respect than I ever has as I've watched the inner workings of all the different things that you have to consider. And it's remarkable and something I have a great deal of respect for.
Thank you. And the feelings likewise. We've had a great relationship with our friends at Public Health, and it's been a great learning experience, I think, for both agencies, and I know that's going to continue. Any comments, questions while we have Dr. White here?
I will comment, Commissioner, on one thing that we've had several questions, and I wish I had an answer, and so I'm going to start out at the beginning saying I don't have an answer for this issue. And the issue is, give us a metric that tells us that when this happens, then we need to close schools. The problem is there isn't really a metric that's going to reflect your district. You have numerous schools in numerous counties in your district. If you have Connie County school and half of the teachers come from the surrounding counties, what is actually happening in Connie County really doesn't reflect what you need to know for your school district. Many of the counties are small counties, and changing 1 or 2 cases is enough to completely change a percentage, because when you're dealing with small numbers, it doesn't take much to change a percentage. There is not an easy number. And I've said this in a couple of meetings, we've gone and looked at other states and thought, well, maybe somebody's come up with something that we could offer to people and say, well, when this happens, and this, when 1 + 1 = 2, that's when you need to consider closing schools. The complexity does not allow that type of decision-making metric, and I wish it did, but I don't have anything. We've not given up. We're still playing around with some ideas. We're still in conversation with other states to see if they've come up with something. And if that actually happens, I will be thrilled to share that with you. But right now, there's no one metric that we can say, this is the line in the sand. If you get here, then close your school. We don't have that. It's much more complex.
I agree, Dr. White, and I actually wrote a quote down from Dr. Stack when he spoke to the teacher and staff town hall, and talking about that very issue and about the great responsibility that is upon our superintendents. And he described it as educated judgment based upon knowledge of the community. And obviously, that knowledge of the community means talking to your local health department. There's just not going to be a metric there necessarily, as Dr. White describes. It's using your professional judgment, knowing your parents, knowing your students, knowing your community, knowing the layout of your buildings. All of that is going to be factoring in, and that's why we have superintendents. That's why we have local boards of education, for this very reason. So I think that's very important. And related to that, Dr. White, I know that if the governor does end up making a recommendation that districts need to refrain from in-person classes the first few weeks of August, which is possible. I know some superintendents and local board members have asked, well, why can't we know that in this county, in Connie County and Kevin County, we only have a few cases. And we understand that Jefferson and Fayette probably shouldn't go to in-person classes right now, but we think we're okay. But the reason that is going to need to apply to the entire state is because of what Dr. White just said. For example, the school that's close to where I'm sitting right now, the elementary school, I was talking to my dad, who has knowledge of the employees that work there. The majority of those teachers and staff members come from outside this community. They're coming from Richmond, Berea, Mount Vernon, Rockcastle County, Nicholasville, Danville. And so it's a regional draw, and that's not unusual for a lot of elementary schools and a lot of any school around the state. And when you factor that in, and even if you don't have many cases, I bet every district, every county in Kentucky has had individuals this weekend go to Tennessee or come back from the beach. And so all of those are risk factors coming back into our communities. And so all that is being taken into consideration when these types of recommendations are made.
Mm-hmm. We had a county in eastern Kentucky that had 9 cases, and within 14 days they had 78 cases. And all that took was 2 family vacations on the coast, a birthday party, and 2 churches, and they went to 78 cases in less than 2 weeks. It happens quickly, and you can be caught in the middle of it with the best laid plans. So going by the numbers is very deceptive.
I very agree. I think Eric Kennedy has something in the chat there, talking about confirming what we just said.
Commissioner, Jim Flynn here. You all kind of preempted all my questions, but what I've been hearing from superintendents is, that they want to know that the guidance that we're working from is still relevant and the direction we need to be working with making our plans, and really are trying to understand what's the threshold, on the rate of infections that they really need to look at, because, just what you all have mentioned, it's just so complicated, and they're just, they're kind of looking for a path forward in terms of making that those kinds of tough decisions with their boards and their communities. And so I don't know if there's a way to help them, look at the data, with their local health partners and you all to determine what's the best path forward. But just know they worked really hard and long on putting these plans together to try to offer parents, options and students options. And, and I think what they're worried about is that in many of these districts, 70, 80, even over 90% of the families are wanting to choose an in-person option. And, but they want to do it in a way that keeps everybody safe. And so, that's what they're grappling with and trying to figure out. And, So they're looking for what's the threshold on the metrics that they need to really concentrate on that can guide that decision. So any help is welcome.
And I think you look at your county data and you look at your trends. And so you look at how many cases did we have this week versus the week before that versus the week before that. And if you're seeing a trend that's going up, that may give you some pause. Now, is it going up gradually over time, or is it exponential? If you're really starting to see a rise, that may influence what you're doing. If you've got 90% of your families that say we want in person, and you see a community who's doing their social distancing and they're wearing their mask to try to decrease their viral load in their community, then you try that. You can always close and go to your other options. One question that I got, I believe it was during the teacher meeting, was, so if we close, have we wasted all our time on these plans? And the answer to that is absolutely not. Because I forget whose comment it was earlier, was when this is over, if it's ever over. Well, it is eventually going to be over. Numbers are eventually going to start going down and staying down. And you're going to have some well thought out plans that you have worked with all of your partners in order to be sure you've got your best input. So even if something happened that school didn't open in person until September 1, and I'm just making that up, no one called me and asked my opinion, but even if that were to happen, September 1, you've got a solid, well thought out, and everyone knows what your plan is, so you can jump right in September 1 and not lose a lot of time pondering, now what are we going to do next? So the time has not been wasted. You've really done a great advantage for your staff and your students by doing this.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. One of the other things that superintendents are grappling with is kind of the difference in thinking. When you think about the CDC guidance and recommendations, even the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations, they talk about the risk of not reopening for some children in particular pose a greater risk because of abuse, neglect, other risky activities, or lack of nutrition, all those kinds of things that are more dangerous than what the evidence is for COVID-19. So can you help us reconcile that a bit in terms of how do we speak to that, how do we think about that, and how do we communicate with our stakeholders about that?
Well, the very first time I ever heard Dr. Deborah Burke speak was at one of the first press conference that the White House had, and she told a story of a young girl who came back from school, and her mother died from the Spanish flu, and she was the one that brought it home from school and killed her mother. And this was Dr. Burke's mother herself. And so she lived with her the rest of her life knowing that she had killed her mother because she brought home the Spanish flu from school. So you've got other side effects beyond the health issues of the children, but you've got that spreading to other adults. You've got that spreading to the grandparents. You've got spreading to places that we know we don't want that to happen. We don't know the long-term effects because, as I said, it's only been here for a few months, and we don't know even children who don't have symptoms to a great degree, and 16% of them don't have any symptoms at all, which if you do the math, that's like 84% do have symptoms. But we don't know what kind of long-term effects this is going to have, and we certainly don't know what kind of long-term effects this is going to have on the adults. So that's why the care of getting back to school in the right way is important, and then the decision making of when is it too much of a load in the community that we have to just wait until the mandatory mask wearing and the changes of the social norms decreases to the point that your viral load in your community goes down.
Dr. Flynn, thank you for that guidance and feedback.
Thank you all. We'll keep rolling our sleeves rolled up and trying to figure out the best path forward. But thanks for your help.
But you are right. Those comments you made keep me up at night as we try to balance all of those issues.
And Todd Allen just posted some feedback in the chat regarding mandatory reporting requirements. Just a reminder to everyone as you're talking to your members that teachers and school staff we are all mandatory reporters in the state, all citizens, but that does not change just because we're having NTI. So if there are cues that teachers are picking up on through telephone communications or other communications with students, even though it's not in person, there's still a mandatory reporting requirement of suspected abuse or neglect. I know it's going to be harder to maybe have those have that evidence with not seeing a child in person, but it's still there.
Hey, Commissioner, one final thing I'll just mention is probably maybe needs something to consider for a future meeting or a superintendent webinar. But in anticipation that we are back on, some kind of remote learning call, then what to do with our classified employees during that time. Some districts, for example, use bus drivers to deliver meals during the remote learning phase. But then I know some were worried about that spreading the virus. So, thinking about legitimate things for them to do or options for districts to navigate, particularly with the classified staff, is something I hear superintendents grapple with.
Understood. No, there will continue to be need for professional development for all classes of employees. We also know that can only extend so long and so many hours and days for that. But we need to make sure we are getting information out to school districts about new professional development. For example, custodial staff, that is now a skilled trade in many respects regarding mixing and amounts of disinfectant and ratios and all of those things. So we know there's going to be a need for additional training, and that obviously could help fill in some of that time through professional development, virtually or otherwise. But I'll ask Robin and Kay Kennedy to flag that as a continued issue. Probably will be a lot more difficult this semester than maybe last semester of filling in those gaps.
Commissioner, the other thing that I would add is the Kentucky Board of Education will also be entertaining our emergency regulation to prevent the granting of additional emergency days by local school districts, and that'll be heard at the August board meeting. So that it is going to be a heavy lift the longer districts have to go with some of their staff. And so in order to grant that maximum flexibility, that is another emergency regulation that will be considered.
Thank you, Robin. There's also some conversation in the chat right now about a potential agenda item for the next task force meeting, and I believe I concur that would be a great agenda item. Karen, if you could make note of that. It's regarding compulsory education and educational neglect court proceedings. It'd be a great and timely update as we start a new school year and how that might be a little different during the pandemic.
Yep, already noted.
And I think we have several volunteers there and looking at the chat conversation to present. Don't forget your exit slip. It's posted in the chat around 2:58. We do use the exit slip information. Sometimes if you're not comfortable posting comment or feedback in the chat or raising your hand, we certainly take that feedback from the exit slip as well. It also helps us in planning future meetings. Any other items, please feel free to speak up or add to the chat. And don't forget, tomorrow we will have our weekly superintendent webcast at from 2 until 4. And then, of course, I believe we're anticipating press briefings from the governor every day this week, most likely, certainly today. Dr. White, anything else?
Nothing I can think of. See you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you online. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.